Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the shadowed chambers of history to ponder a question that's been swirling like a fog for over 4 centuries. What exactly caused the death of Elizabeth I? Picture it, the great Tudor queen, crowned amidst glitter and ceremony, now fading away in a drafty palace room, her breath shallow, her eyes dimming. You probably won't survive this deep dive into royal decline, mostly because it's far less a thrilling tale of poison and palace coups than a slow, unsettling descent that no one truly understood at the time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there, because somewhere, someone's probably nodding off while learning about a queen who shaped an empire. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in early 1603, in the dim corridors of Whitehall Palace, London. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who has ruled England for 44 years, is no longer the vibrant figure you might remember from portraits draped in ruffs and jewels. Instead, she is pale, frail, and burdened by the weight of years and responsibility. The summer sun that once kissed her cheeks now seems to mock her weakening frame. The queen, once known for her iron will and sharp wit, moves with the caution of a much older woman, her step slower, her face marked by a weary sadness. Despite being the most powerful woman in England, Elizabeth's days in this period are tinged with increasing solitude. She has outlived many of her close advisors and trusted friends, and the court that once buzzed with vibrant politics feels more like a cage. You can almost hear the soft echo of her footsteps in the grand halls, mingling with the quiet whispers of courtiers speculating about what will happen when the queen finally breathes her last. Historians still argue whether her decline was the inevitable result of aging or hastened by some hidden ailment. Some say her health began to unravel during the harsh winter months of 1602 to 1603, when England was gripped by cold and scarcity. The chill in the air, the damp stone walls, and the scarcity of fresh produce during the lean months could easily have contributed to respiratory illnesses or general physical decline. Others suggest a more sinister possibility, that the queen was slowly poisoned. Whether by accident or design. Rumors swirled then, as they often do in courts, of enemies near and far eager to claim the throne. The truth, as is often the case with history, is tangled in the threads of conflicting reports, faded letters, and the murky memory of those who watched her final days. What we do know is that Elizabeth's last months were marked by a subtle but unmistakable change. The fire that lit her speeches flickered, her legendary energy dulled. Those closest to her noticed she spoke less, slept more, and her once brilliant complexion lost its rosy glow. She retreated into solitude, confiding only in a trusted few, while courtiers whispered anxiously about what the future might hold. It said she even began to neglect her appearance, a stark contrast to the queen known for her elaborate dress and makeup, as if the will to maintain royal poise was slipping alongside her health. Imagine the sounds around her, the low murmur of attendants, the rustle of heavy velvet curtains, the faint creak of palace floorboards. Outside, London carried on unaware that its monarch was fading like a candle nearing its end. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if mourning. The scent of beeswax and lavender from her chambers mingled with the faint but persistent odor of dampness that seemed to cling to the old palace walls. These sensory details create an almost tangible atmosphere of slow decay, the inevitable approach of an ending long awaited but never welcomed. A quirky tidbit: despite her reputation for strength, Elizabeth apparently suffered from bouts of severe toothache and other ailments that would make even the most stoic of rulers grimace. You might chuckle to know that she reportedly used crocodile dung as a form of sunscreen, a bizarre remedy that sounds like it belongs more in a witch's brew than a queen's beauty routine. But it shows the strange blend of ancient and medieval knowledge that influenced even the highest echelons of power. Remember, this is a time when dental care was rudimentary at best. She might have been living with pain that would drive anyone to despair. Doctors of the day tried their best with what they knew, employing remedies ranging from bloodletting to herbal concoctions. Yet, the effectiveness of such treatments remains questionable. The medical wisdom of Elizabeth's time was a mix of superstition, trial, and error, with doctors sometimes doing more harm than good. Some physicians believed illnesses were caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Their treatments often involved draining blood or inducing vomiting, methods that likely weakened the queen further. Historians still debate whether these practices might have accelerated her decline rather than eased it. As you settle further into this narrative, consider this: you are following the footsteps of a queen who defined an era but faced a very human ending, an ending wrapped in mystery, debate, and a quiet, almost poetic, fading away. She was a woman who controlled a nation with unmatched poise and intellect, yet in her final days, she was vulnerable, fragile, and isolated. This duality between the powerful monarch and the ailing woman makes her story endlessly fascinating, even if the exact cause of her death remains just out of reach. You can almost hear the faint echo of her final thoughts, perhaps tinged with regret, pride, or simply exhaustion. And as we begin to unravel the threads of her last days, you realize that what lies ahead is less a tale of dramatic betrayal and more a somber meditation on mortality itself, an invitation to see beyond the crown and into the delicate human heart beneath. You step deeper into Elizabeth's final year, 1602. It was a time when her once steely grip on England's throne began to falter, not through sudden betrayal or scandal, but through the quiet, creeping weight of age and the harsh realities of life in a world without modern medicine. The days grow shorter, the winter colder, and the queen's health visibly declines. You might imagine her walking through the chilly corridors of Richmond Palace, wrapped in heavy cloaks, the chill biting through the layers. Her breath comes shorter, her hands tremble slightly, and even the vibrant courtiers around her start to exchange worried glances. It's worth noting that Elizabeth was already in her late 60s, which was quite old for the time. Average life expectancy hovered around 35 to 40 years, though of course nobles and royalty could live longer due to better nutrition and living conditions. Still, the queen's body was feeling the toll of nearly 5 decades on the throne, not to mention the psychological pressure of constant political intrigue. She had survived countless assassination plots, religious turmoil, and the enormous burden of ruling a kingdom that was rapidly transforming. But the body has its limits, and in 1602, those limits began to show. Historians still argue whether the queen's decline was hastened by a specific illness or merely the natural aging process exacerbated by the physical and emotional stress she endured. Some medical historians have proposed that Elizabeth might have suffered from pneumonia, a common and often deadly respiratory infection, especially in the cold, damp English climate of the time. Others speculate she might have had cancer or chronic infections, but without modern diagnostics, this remains guesswork. One of the more interesting fringe theories suggests that Elizabeth could have had mercury poisoning. Mercury was widely used in medicinal treatments during the Tudor era, particularly for skin conditions and as a purgative. But the metal is highly toxic, and prolonged exposure could cause neurological damage, tremors, and ultimately death. If this sounds like an early version of too much of a good thing, well, that's precisely what historians debate. Was the queen being poisoned by her treatments rather than an assassin's blade? You might picture the queen's chambers filled with the faint smell of herbs and alchemical concoctions, vials clinking as attendants prepared bitters and powders. Her personal physicians were no strangers to the era's medicinal fashions. They often mixed potent and potentially poisonous ingredients in the hope of prolonging her life. Meanwhile, political tensions simmer beneath the surface. Elizabeth's failure to name a successor left the court in a nervous state. The question of who would follow her had been the subject of whispered debates for years, and as her health worsened, those debates grew louder. Some courtiers favored James VI of Scotland, a Protestant who had a strong claim as the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Others hoped for different outcomes, but Elizabeth kept her cards close to her chest. Despite her frailty, the queen remained sharp, displaying flashes of the wit and resolve that had defined her reign. She summoned advisers, weighed matters of state, and even quipped with those around her. But the toll of illness was clear. Her speeches became shorter, and her movements slower. Friends and attendants reported that she often seemed lost in thought, staring out windows at a world she might soon leave behind. There's a quirky side note to her decline. Elizabeth reportedly had a pet monkey. Not exactly what you'd expect in a Tudor palace, but exotic animals were a symbol of status and fascination. Some say the monkey stayed close to her during her final days, a small, strange comfort amid the palace's cold grandeur. The presence of such an unusual companion offers a rare glimpse into the personal, less formal side of the Queen's life. After all, she was human, with attachments and small joys. As you imagine this scene, consider how the sounds and sensations of the palace might have affected Elizabeth's state of mind. The clatter of armor being polished, the murmur of servants moving quietly, the distant tolling of church bells marking the hours. All wrapped in a fog of anticipation and unease. The court was holding its breath, waiting for a chapter to close. In these last months, doctors continued their efforts, often employing practices like bloodletting and purging, based on the belief that illnesses were caused by imbalances in bodily humors. Some treatments involved leeches or the application of blistering agents to the skin, which might sound brutal now, but were cutting-edge medicine then. Historians still argue whether these treatments harmed the Queen more than helped her, or if she might have survived longer without them. As her body weakened, Elizabeth's mind seemed to retreat into memories and reflections. Those around her spoke of moments when she appeared deeply contemplative, perhaps wrestling with the burden of her legacy and the uncertainty of England's future. You can almost feel the cool draft coming through the palace windows, mixing with the warmth of candlelight flickering against tapestry-covered walls. It is a scene of quiet introspection and fragile endings. Remember, this is the woman who defeated the Spanish Armada, who navigated the treacherous waters of religious conflict, and who shaped an entire era of English history. Now, she faces the universal truth that no crown can shield against mortality. You find yourself lingering on the cusp between Elizabeth's final days and the uncertain dawn that follows. It's early 1603, and the atmosphere in London has shifted subtly but palpably. The city feels heavy with anticipation, a buzz of whispered rumors threading through its crowded streets and taverns like smoke from countless hearth fires. People speculate, some hopeful, others fearful. What happens next now that the Queen's strength has all but faded? The old Tudor Queen, once called the Virgin Queen and Gloriana, has become a shadow of her formidable self. She lies mostly confined to bed in Richmond Palace, the same place where years before she had dazzled diplomats and nobility alike. The opulence is still there, the embroidered curtains, the gilded furniture, however, the life force that filled these rooms has dwindled. You almost hear the faint echo of the bustling court from years past, now replaced by the hushed footfalls of worried attendants and physicians. One widely accepted historical fact is that Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, at the age of 69. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart era, with James VI of Scotland ascending as James I of England. This transfer of power united the crowns of England and Scotland, forever changing the political landscape. But the days leading up to her passing are shrouded in mystery and debate. You might picture a particularly cold and damp English spring, a season notorious for spreading illness, especially respiratory diseases like pneumonia or influenza, which historians often mention as potential causes of her demise. The Queen reportedly suffered a high fever, severe weakness, and difficulty breathing, classic symptoms consistent with such infections. Yet, since medical records from the time are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, historians still argue whether pneumonia was the sole cause or if other chronic conditions played a part. On the fringe side of things, there's a curious story about Elizabeth's final meal. Some accounts suggest she dined on a simple chicken broth. Others hint at a more unusual dish, perhaps a preparation involving pottage with a mysterious herb known as nightshade. This plant is notorious for its toxicity, yet was sometimes used medicinally in tiny doses. Could it have contributed to her failing health? Or was it simply a mistaken inclusion in the palace's kitchen records? The question remains tantalizingly open. You also have to imagine the subtle but profound effects of stress and isolation during those last days. Elizabeth, a woman who had held absolute power, now confronted the ultimate loss of control over her own life. It's said that she expressed frustration and fear at times, a rare vulnerability for a monarch famous for her iron will. You might hear her quiet sighs mingling with the sound of the rain tapping on the palace windows, a mournful duet signaling the slow fading of an era. Interestingly, a few personal items reportedly found in Elizabeth's chambers after her death offer a glimpse into her state of mind. Among them was a small, worn prayer book, heavily annotated, suggesting she may have turned increasingly toward faith and reflection as her strength waned. In one passage, she apparently wrote about the fleeting nature of earthly power, a poignant reminder that even queens must face their mortality. The political tension at court grew more intense as the Queen's condition worsened. The Privy Council prepared for the inevitable, debating how best to manage the transition of power without plunging England into chaos. James VI had long been expected to succeed Elizabeth, but questions lingered about his loyalty to English traditions and his ability to govern a land both familiar and foreign to him. Some courtiers schemed to influence the young Scottish king, while others hoped for a peaceful handover. There's a quirky tale about how a few loyal servants tried to distract Elizabeth during her last days, playing music and telling her stories to lift her spirits. One favorite was reportedly a bawdy ballad about a foolish knight and his adventures with a dragon. Hardly the refined court entertainment you'd expect, but apparently effective at bringing a smile to the Queen's lips. This small detail humanizes her further, showing a monarch who could still enjoy a bit of humor, even when facing the end. Historians still argue how much influence Elizabeth exerted in her final hours. Was she aware of the plans being made, or had illness clouded her mind? Some suggest she may have deliberately delayed naming a successor to avoid upsetting the delicate balance of power. Others argue that the Queen's famed political savvy extended to orchestrating a smooth succession behind the scenes, even as her body failed her. In the midst of all this, the City of London prepared for a funeral like no other. Elizabeth's reign had lasted 45 years, the longest of any English monarch up to that point. Her death symbolized not just the loss of a ruler but the end of an epoch, the Elizabethan age. Citizens gathered in churches and marketplaces, sharing stories of her victories and controversies, their voices tinged with sorrow and awe. You might imagine the procession that would soon take place, the grand pageantry of a royal funeral, the somber tolling of bells, the thick velvet drapes pulled back to reveal a queen lying in state. The streets lined with mourners, the scent of incense and freshly cut flowers filling the air. It was an event designed to cement Elizabeth's legacy and remind England of her monumental impact. Before all that, though, there was the quiet stillness of the moment when her breath finally stopped, when time itself seemed to pause. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath from the court and country alike, as if the world knew something irrevocable had just occurred. The Virgin Queen, who had survived so many storms, was gone. As Elizabeth's final breath fades into history, you are drawn into the immediate aftermath, the quiet, tense hours where rumor and reality blur. The palace, once bustling with courtiers and advisors vying for influence, now settles into a hushed stillness broken only by the soft shuffle of footsteps and whispered conversations. It's a moment thick with uncertainty and possibility. One indisputable fact is that Elizabeth's body was embalmed and prepared for public display in London. Her funeral procession was meticulously planned to project the image of a dignified monarch, a queen who ruled not just with power but with divine right and grace. The body lay in state at Westminster Abbey for several days, allowing thousands of subjects to pay their respects. You can imagine the line of people stretching around the block, commoners, nobles, foreign dignitaries, all united in a shared farewell. But even in these somber moments, there are curious stories that hint at the more human side of the event. One such story tells of a rather awkward mishap during the embalming process. Apparently, the royal embalmer accidentally spilled some of the preservative fluid onto the queen's ornate robes, causing a strange discoloration. Courtiers quickly covered it with a new velvet cloth, but the incident spread as palace gossip and gave rise to an unusual nickname among some, the Queen in Stain. Not exactly the royal epitaph one would hope for. But it humanizes the event, reminding you that even state ceremonies are prone to mishaps. Historians still argue whether the embalming practices of the time might have affected the condition of Elizabeth's remains, complicating later examinations and contributing to ongoing debates about the exact cause of her death. The medical techniques in the early 17th century were rudimentary by modern standards, relying on a mixture of tradition, superstition, and trial and error. Some scholars speculate that poor embalming may have hastened the deterioration of her body, while others think it was handled with the utmost care to preserve her dignity. Meanwhile, the political scene beyond the palace was already shifting dramatically. James VI of Scotland, Elizabeth's closest male relative and the likely heir, began preparations for his journey south to claim the English throne. His arrival was eagerly anticipated but not without controversy. Some English nobles distrusted the Scots and worried about how James might govern a kingdom he had never ruled before. You might picture the tension as the two courts, English and Scottish, merged under one monarch, a union of different cultures, languages, and political traditions. A quirky, lesser-known fact from this time involves a group of Londoners who attempted to smuggle a large number of cats into the city during the funeral period. Why cats? Apparently, superstition held that cats could ward off evil spirits, and with the death of the great queen, many feared malevolent forces might roam the streets. The city authorities were less than pleased with this feline influx and promptly arrested the would-be smugglers. You have to smile a little imagining these secret cat carriers sneaking around in the dead of night, convinced that purring protectors would keep the city safe. The scholarly debate doesn't just stop at the embalming or the succession. Some historians also question how much Elizabeth's death truly changed England's social fabric. Did the passing of a long-reigning monarch bring a genuine sense of new beginnings, or was it more of a slow, uneasy continuation under a new name? Some argue the Elizabethan age was more a cultural myth than a clear historical period, a label applied retrospectively that smooths over the messy realities of political power and social upheaval. In the days following the Queen's death, rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Elizabeth's death was the result of poisoning, perhaps orchestrated by those who feared her influence even in death. Others claimed she had been weakened by the heartbreak of lost loves and betrayals throughout her reign. While these claims remain speculative, they reveal the human need to find drama and explanation in moments of mystery. You can also imagine the palpable sadness among those closest to her, her ladies-in-waiting, secretaries, and personal attendants who had witnessed the Queen's strength and vulnerability up close. Many wrote letters and diaries describing their grief, painting Elizabeth as more than just a distant figure on a throne, but a woman who inspired fierce loyalty and affection. One such loyal servant, a certain Robert Carey, famously rushed to Scotland upon hearing the news, eager to present himself to King James and assure him of his support. His journey was fraught with urgency and intrigue, underscoring the complex web of personal and political relationships that surrounded Elizabeth's death. Carey's story later became the stuff of legend, symbolizing the shifting tides of allegiance that mark any royal succession. As you envision all this, the grand funeral procession looms near. A solemn parade through the streets of London, with mourners clad in black, trumpets sounding, and the Queen's coffin carried on a lavishly decorated hearse. The city's atmosphere was a mix of sorrow and spectacle, a public theater designed to honor the monarch and reinforce the continuity of the crown. Remember the earlier tale of the Queen in Stain? Well, the procession's organizers ensured that no visible blemishes would mar the Queen's image in public. It's an early example of what we might now call brand management, centuries before social media made it a necessity. Ultimately, Elizabeth's death set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not just England but the wider British Isles. The union under James I marked the beginning of a new chapter, one with its own triumphs and trials. Yet, the mystery around the exact circumstances of Elizabeth's death ensures that the last days of the Tudor queen remain a captivating story for historians and sleepy listeners alike. You find yourself walking down the narrow, twisting corridors of the late Elizabethan court, where the air still hums faintly with political intrigue and whispered secrets. Now that Elizabeth is gone, the throne is vacant but for one man, James VI of Scotland, soon to be James I of England. His ascent is momentous, but it's anything but smooth sailing. Here's the first plain truth: James's claim to the English throne was solid through his great-grandmother, Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. Yet many English nobles and common folk greeted the idea of a Scottish king with skepticism and even hostility. You can almost hear the grumbling in the taverns and drawing rooms, like, do we really want a king who pronounces whiskey differently and calls chips crisps? Well, some things never change. James's arrival in England in 1603 was marked by a grand procession that was supposed to signal unity and the dawn of a peaceful new era. Instead, it revealed just how precarious this union would be. The English courtiers, used to Elizabeth's theatrical control of power, found James's more traditional, scholarly demeanor a bit dull. He was a man of books and sermons, not sharp theatrical displays. His preference for routine and ritual felt stuffy to some, though it suited others just fine. Historians still argue whether James's less charismatic style weakened the monarchy or simply reflected the changing political culture of the time, but you get the feeling that James had his own ways of keeping power interesting. For one, he was a notorious author. Yes, a king who wrote poetry and even a treatise called The True Law of Free Monarchies, where he defended the divine right of kings. Imagine a modern-day ruler tweeting essays about why they should rule absolutely. Some would find it pompous, others enlightening. This blend of intellectualism and royal arrogance made him an oddly compelling figure. A quirky snippet from his early reign involves his infamous obsession with the Glamis ghost at his childhood home in Scotland. Legend has it that James believed his family castle was haunted by spirits that could foretell the future or warn of danger. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, this gave James an edge of the supernatural to his otherwise scholarly image. You can picture him pacing Glamis's ancient halls, muttering to himself about spectral warnings while clutching a candle. On the political front, James's reign saw the merging of two very different kingdoms under one crown, yet Parliament remained separate for a while. This set the stage for centuries of tension between the monarch and the English legislature. Remember that moment from Elizabeth's reign when Parliament occasionally grumbled but generally deferred? With James, the relationship soured quickly. His belief in the divine right of kings often clashed with Parliament's growing appetite for power and influence. Historians debate whether James's stubbornness or the rising strength of Parliament was to blame for this tension, but it's clear their power struggle shaped England's future. Amid these political dramas, James's court developed a reputation for scandal and flamboyance. Rumors swirled about his close relationships with male favorites, notably Robert Carr and George Villiers. The court was a theater of lavish parties, intrigue, and sometimes vicious rivalries. You can almost hear the court gossip. Did you see how James lavished that diamond on Villiers? Scandalous. Whether these friendships were romantic or purely political remains a debated topic among historians, but they certainly added color to an otherwise austere monarchy. One lighter note: James was famously obsessed with hunting and even brought his own hunting dogs from Scotland. He loved the chase, though his hunting expeditions often left a trail of ruined countryside and ruffled feathers among his nobles. You can picture James charging through the English woods, flanked by a noisy pack of hounds, very much a king on a mission, though maybe not the most discreet one. Yet despite these quirks and controversies, James's reign began with a hopeful spirit. He sought to unite his kingdoms, patronize the arts, and maintain peace. His support for the translation of the Bible into English, the famous King James Version, was a lasting cultural gift that shaped language and religion for centuries. You might have heard passages from it in churches or literature. Its poetic cadence still resonates. Historians still argue whether James was a visionary ruler or simply a man out of step with his times. Was his belief in absolute monarchy a noble ideal or a recipe for conflict? Did his cultural achievements outweigh his political missteps? These debates linger, inviting you to ponder the complexities behind the crown. In the background of all this, the shadow of Elizabeth's death looms large. Her long reign left a legacy that was hard to match. James was stepping into shoes that were at once admired and daunting. The new king had to navigate not only the practical challenges of ruling two kingdoms but also the high expectations set by his formidable predecessor. As you imagine the early days of James's rule, you also catch whispers of growing unrest in the religious landscape. England was a patchwork of Catholics, Anglicans, and Puritans, each with their own hopes and fears under a new monarch. James's policies tried to balance these tensions but sometimes alienated key groups. It's like walking a tightrope over a sea of discontent. One misstep could spell disaster. You can almost hear the anxious murmurs among the Puritans, who hoped for reform but instead faced continued restrictions. Meanwhile, Catholic plots simmered beneath the surface, ready to explode. The famous gunpowder plot of 1605, which aimed to blow up Parliament and kill James, was still a couple of years away, but the seeds were being sown now. You're drawn into this web of political maneuvering, religious tension, and personal drama. The passing of Elizabeth I was not just the end of an era, it was the opening act of a new, turbulent story where the future of England and Scotland would be forged amid hope, suspicion, and, of course, a little royal ghost hunting. The early days of King James's reign ripple with an odd mix of solemn ceremony and barely concealed tension. You watch as the new monarch tries to assert his authority over a kingdom still smarting from Elizabeth's departure, like stepping onto a stage while the audience is still buzzing about the previous star. It's a delicate dance, and you can almost hear the creak of the royal throne as James tries to settle into it. One straightforward fact: James I was the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland simultaneously, creating what was called the Union of the Crowns. But here's a twist: he didn't unite the two countries politically. They remained separate kingdoms with their own parliaments, laws, and traditions. Think of it like two roommates sharing a house but refusing to clean up the kitchen together. The idea of unifying England and Scotland into a single country would take centuries more. With James planting the initial seeds, this political setup created plenty of room for confusion and frustration. English courtiers often saw their Scottish counterparts as rough and uncultured, while Scots viewed the English as haughty and self-important. James himself had to navigate this cultural minefield, trying to blend his Scottish background with English expectations. He famously brought Scottish customs, like the use of tartans and the peculiar pronunciation of certain words, which didn't always go over well in English high society. You can almost hear some noblemen tut-tooting over a Scottish accent, grumbling about that barbaric way of speaking. Historians still argue whether James's failure to fully integrate the two kingdoms was a missed opportunity or a prudent caution. Was he ahead of his time with the concept of a united Britain, or was he naive in thinking he could govern two very different peoples with the same style? The debate continues among scholars. On a more peculiar note, James had a fascination with witchcraft that is both fascinating and, frankly, a little eerie. Unlike Elizabeth, who largely ignored or dismissed witch hunts, James took the subject very seriously. In fact, he authored a book called Demonology in 1597, long before he became King of England, outlining his belief in witches and their supposed dangers. Once on the English throne, he presided over some infamous witch trials, such as those in Pendle, Lancashire, where several women were accused and executed. You can almost picture James, in his royal robes, nodding solemnly at accusations of spellcasting, convinced he was protecting his kingdom from dark forces. It's weird to think that the king himself could be so terrified of witches while simultaneously promoting a more rational and scholarly approach to governance in other areas. This contradiction has historians scratching their heads. Some suggest his witchcraft paranoia reflected broader societal fears of the time, others see it as a personal obsession tied to his own insecurities. Back at court, James's tastes clashed with English sensibilities in amusing ways. For example, he had a penchant for extravagant clothing and jewels, often favoring gaudy colors and oversized hats. English courtiers whispered that he looked more like a peacock than a king, but James didn't care. He loved to make an impression, using fashion as a form of soft power. You can imagine him strutting through the corridors, all velvet and feathers, with a courtier trying to keep up with the sheer volume of jewels jingling. And here's a quirky tidbit: James was surprisingly fond of lemon trees. Yes, lemon trees, something quite exotic in England at the time. He even kept some in the royal gardens and was said to enjoy the scent and the challenge of growing them in the chilly climate. It's a small but vivid detail that humanizes the monarch. Amid all the political drama and royal pomp, there was a man who took pleasure in tending his little lemon trees. The religious landscape during James's early reign was a simmering pot of conflicts. While he was Protestant, he aimed for a certain moderation, hoping to calm the heated disputes between Anglicans, Puritans, and Catholics. His famous declaration "No bishop, no king" revealed his belief that the Church of England's hierarchical structure was essential to maintaining royal authority. This didn't win him many friends among Puritans, who wanted to strip away the bishops and reform the church further. You get the sense that James was a man who liked order and hierarchy, both in church and state. When faced with the Puritans' demands for radical reform, he famously told them to think yourself lucky you are not in Scotland. That was his way of saying, "Don't push me." Historians still argue whether this stance was pragmatic wisdom or stubbornness that contributed to later unrest. James's attempts to balance religious factions also fed into the infamous Gunpowder Plot, which unfolded just 2 years into his English reign. A group of Catholic conspirators, frustrated by persecution and hoping to restore Catholic rule, planned to blow up Parliament during the state opening and kill James. The plot's failure and the capture of Guy Fawkes became a legendary moment in British history, celebrated every year on Bonfire Night. You can almost smell the smoke and hear the crackling bonfires that mark the memory of that explosive episode, but in the quieter moments away from politics and religion, James's court was a hub of culture and intellectual life. He was a patron of the arts, supporting playwrights like Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. The King James Bible, commissioned in 1604 and completed in 1611, was one of his lasting legacies. It was a work of majestic prose that influenced English-speaking Christianity for centuries. Historians still debate whether James truly understood the significance of the Bible translation or saw it more as a political tool to unify his kingdoms under a shared religious text. Either way, its poetic rhythm and literary power remain undeniable, echoing through centuries of sermons and literature. As you settle into this chapter of history, you might find yourself imagining the eccentricities and contradictions of a king trying to hold together two nations, wrestling with superstition, political ambition, and cultural divides. The early reign of James I sets the stage for a new era, one of promise, but also of conflict and mystery. You trudge deeper into the labyrinth of early 17th century England, where the undercurrents of tension swirl beneath the surface like fog over the Thames. James I's reign is settling in, but the kingdom's challenges are anything but calm. You can almost hear the murmurs behind closed doors, whispers of unrest mixing with the clinking of fine glassware at court banquets. The atmosphere is thick with anticipation, like waiting for a thunderstorm that refuses to break. One solid fact to hold on to: the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 was a real, nail-biting conspiracy aimed at blowing up Parliament and killing the king. You probably know about Guy Fawkes, the man caught guarding the barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords. His arrest on the night of November 4th and the plot's subsequent unraveling remain iconic moments in British history. The failed attempt didn't just save James's life, it sparked an annual tradition of bonfires and fireworks, still celebrated today as Guy Fawkes Night. But here's where it gets more intriguing. Historians still argue whether the entire gunpowder plot was a genuine Catholic conspiracy or if it was, at least in part, manipulated or exaggerated by the authorities to justify harsher repression. Some fringe theories suggest that the government may have had prior knowledge or even encouraged the plot's discovery to strengthen James's grip on power. Imagine a cloak-and-dagger drama with layers of deception and propaganda. It sounds like the perfect plot for a historical thriller, doesn't it? In the aftermath, the government cracked down hard on Catholics. Laws banning Catholic worship and restricting civil rights were tightened, forcing the faithful into an underground existence. You can almost feel the cold isolation of secret masses in darkened rooms, the nervous glances of priests and parishioners alike. This repression only deepened divisions and sowed seeds of resentment that would later bloom into bigger conflicts. Meanwhile, James's efforts to soothe religious tensions were complicated by his own personality quirks. He was, after all, a king who fancied himself something of a philosopher and scholar. His writings on kingship famously emphasized the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs are God's appointed rulers, accountable only to him. It's a notion that certainly doesn't invite much democratic debate. You might chuckle imagining James lecturing his courtiers, insisting on his unquestioned authority like a professor handing down final grades. On a lighter note, James's personal habits at court were sometimes at odds with his grand political ideas. The king had a fondness for the theatrical, frequently indulging in elaborate masks, lavish performances mixing music, dance, and costume designed to flatter the monarch and entertain his guests. These spectacles were often absurdly extravagant, with kings and nobles dressing as gods, heroes, or mythological creatures. You can picture James donning a glittering robe, striking a pose, and declaring himself Apollo or Neptune, much to the amusement and occasional eye rolls of his courtiers. Historians still debate whether these lavish entertainments were mere frivolity or a clever form of political messaging, using art and theater to project royal power and unity. Were they a way for James to distract from the kingdom's simmering problems or a genuine expression of cultural renaissance? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. And then there's the curious case of James's reputed fondness for what we'd now call boy favorites at court, young male courtiers who held his favor and influence. This aspect of his personal life has fascinated and perplexed historians for centuries. Some suggest that James's relationships with these favorites influenced court politics, while others see it as a reflection of broader Renaissance ideas about friendship and affection. The exact nature of these relationships remains a scholarly puzzle, complicated by period attitudes and incomplete records. While all this unfolds, the wider world keeps turning. Colonization efforts in the New World are underway, with the establishment of Jamestown in 1607 marking England's first permanent settlement in America. You can almost feel the salty sea breeze and the raw hope of settlers facing an unknown land full of dangers and possibilities. James's reign, after all, coincides with the beginning of the British Empire's global ambitions, a story that would reshape history far beyond the British Isles. In quieter corners of the realm, everyday life marches on with its own rhythms. You might imagine the smell of fresh bread baking in village ovens, the clatter of carts over cobblestone streets, and the murmur of markets where common folk trade goods and gossip. Life under James I was a patchwork of contrasts, royal splendor and rustic hardship, scholarly pursuits and superstitious fears, and remember that earlier curiosity about James's lemon trees. It turns out his interest in exotic plants extended beyond just citrus. The royal gardens began to showcase an array of imported species, reflecting a growing fascination with botany and the natural world. This trend hints at the Renaissance spirit alive even in political turmoil, an urge to explore, classify, and appreciate the wonders of nature. As you drift further into this period, the image of James's court crystallizes, a complex blend of power plays, cultural flourishes, religious strife, and human quirks. It's a world where grand ideas meet petty jealousies, and where the personal and political are deeply entwined. You start to understand that the early Stuart era is less a smooth transition and more a tempestuous passage, setting the stage for the seismic events to come. You slip quietly into the 1620s, a decade that feels as precarious and fragile as walking on thin ice beneath an overcast, unsettled sky. The atmosphere is thick with tension, the kind that lingers and builds slowly, foretelling upheaval. James I has passed away, and his son Charles I has taken the throne, inheriting not only the crown but also a swirling storm of political and religious conflicts that threaten to engulf the entire kingdom. The royal court feels smaller, more confined, almost suffocating, as if secrets lurk behind every curtain and every corridor hums with whispered conspiracies. Suspicion hangs in the air heavier than the lingering smoke from burning incense in the chapels. One unshakable truth anchors you firmly in this turbulent decade: Charles I shares his father's unwavering belief in the divine right of kings, perhaps even with greater stubbornness and rigidity. He rules with an iron will, fully convinced that his authority is granted directly by God, and therefore beyond reproach or challenge. To question the king, in Charles's eyes, is tantamount to questioning the very divine order upon which the realm rests. This unyielding conviction sets Charles on an inevitable collision course with Parliament, which grows increasingly restless, resentful, and determined to assert its own power and rights. Over the course of the 1620s and 1630s, this tension escalates steadily, eventually erupting into open conflict by the late 1630s. A somewhat quirky and humanizing detail stands out amidst the grand political drama: Charles's lifelong obsession with hats. It may seem trivial, but the king owned an astonishing collection of over 1,000 hats, each one carefully crafted and worn with deliberate intention. These were not mere accessories; each hat was designed to project an image of majesty, control, and authority. You might find it amusing to picture Charles pausing thoughtfully before an audience to adjust the brim of his latest wide-brimmed hat, making a regal fashion statement just before delivering a stern dismissal to his council. In the midst of growing rebellion and political unrest, this fixation on hats becomes an odd yet telling symbol of his desire to command respect and impose order. Historians continue to debate Charles's decision to govern without Parliament for 11 years, a period known as the personal rule. Some argue that this was a necessary defense of monarchical tradition, a principled stand to uphold the crown's authority. Others view it as a reckless gamble, a stubborn refusal to adapt that ultimately sealed the fate of his reign and the monarchy itself. Was Charles a steadfast guardian of ancient rights, or an inflexible tyrant blind to the changing realities of his kingdom? This question remains a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, like a complex game of chess played across centuries, with no definitive winner, during this fraught period. Charles's religious policies add fuel to the fire of unrest. His strong support for Archbishop William Laud's efforts to enforce strict Anglican uniformity antagonizes many, especially the Puritans and the Scots. You can almost feel the growing frustration among congregations forced to endure increasingly rigid ceremonies and the creeping suspicion that popery, or Catholic practices, might be returning under the guise of Anglican worship. This religious tension spills over into outright political rebellion, most notably the bishops' wars with Scotland, where Charles's attempts to impose his will face armed resistance and deepening defiance. Amid these heavy and dark clouds of political strife, a remarkable cultural milestone quietly unfolds: the publication of the King James Bible in 1611, a lasting legacy of James I's reign that continues to influence English-speaking faith communities and literature for centuries. You might picture scribes bent over parchment, painstakingly copying text by candlelight, producing a work that would outlive kings, kingdoms, and empires. Even this celebrated translation, however, sits amid controversy. Scholars debate the precise motivations behind its commissioning, questioning whether it was purely a religious endeavor or also a calculated political move aimed at unifying a fractured realm under a common scriptural authority. On a somewhat lighter note, the Stuart court still indulges in its taste for lavish entertainments, even as the political climate grows more volatile. Masks remain a favored form of amusement, with playwrights such as Ben Jonson collaborating with architects like Inigo Jones to create dazzling performances full of music, dance, elaborate costumes, and rich symbolism. These events are far more than mere distractions, they serve as tools to reinforce royal ideology and display the king's grandeur. Much like a medieval form of binge-watching the latest spectacle. You can almost hear the delicate trills of the harpsichord weaving through the rustle of silk and the flutter of feathers, as courtiers lose themselves, if only momentarily, in the shimmering fantasy crafted to uphold royal prestige. Beyond the gilded palace walls, life for the common people reveals the stark contrasts of the era. Economic hardships mount, poor harvests threaten food supplies, and outbreaks of plague bring fear and sorrow. You might imagine damp, chilly streets where the scent of burning wood smoke mingles with less pleasant odors rising from crowded alleys, all underscored by the constant murmur of rumors and anxiety. Survival in this world demands resilience, communal support, and grit, presenting a harsh counterpoint to the opulence and intrigue of the royal court where hats and masks still hold sway. Speaking of resilience, this decade also marks the beginning of a significant chapter in English migration to North America. Religious dissenters, desperate to escape persecution and seeking the freedom to worship as they choose, set sail across the Atlantic. The Pilgrim's journey aboard the Mayflower in 1620 captures a mixture of hope and desperation. You can almost hear the creaking timbers of the ship and feel the sharp spray of salty sea air as passengers wrap themselves tightly against the biting cold, their eyes fixed upon a distant, unknown shore that holds both promise and peril in equal measure. Scholars continue to debate the motivations behind this migration. Was the New World truly a sanctuary for those fleeing religious oppression, or was it more often a last resort for those with few alternatives? The truth lies somewhere in the complex interplay of faith, ambition, economic necessity, and the primal instinct for survival. As you settle more deeply into this decade, the stage is fully set. Kings who hold fast to their divine right to rule face parliaments determined to challenge that authority. Religious divisions deepen and political conflicts escalate, while ordinary people navigate a world caught between royal power struggles and the harsh realities of daily life. England stands at a crossroads, looking inward toward its own fractures and outward to the vast, uncharted possibilities beyond its shores. The decade pulses with tension and uncertainty, laying the groundwork for the upheavals that will soon reshape the nation and change history forever. As you find yourself drifting deeper into the 1630s, the atmosphere thickens with a tense stillness, the kind that hints at a gathering storm just beyond the horizon. King Charles I, ever distinctive with his extravagant and sometimes almost comical collection of hats, continues to rule without the support or approval of Parliament. His reign during this period depends heavily on controversial and deeply unpopular financial strategies designed to keep the royal coffers full. You might almost hear the low, disgruntled murmurs of nobles and landowners compelled to pay the so-called ship money tax. Originally intended to fund the Navy's defense along England's vulnerable coastline, this tax is now being levied well beyond coastal counties. Reaching into the inland regions, which only fuels a growing sense of resentment and injustice among those who must pay. Imagine a game of Monopoly where the banker suddenly demands rent from every player on every turn, refusing to listen to any protests or negotiations. That is the reality for many of Charles's subjects during these years. One unshakable fact stands as a pillar in this decade's story: the period known as the personal rule, or, more harshly by its critics, the 11 Years' Tyranny, begins in 1629 and continues uninterrupted until 1640. By dissolving Parliament and choosing to govern unilaterally, Charles forces many nobles and ordinary citizens into a state of anxious silence. Though beneath this calm, frustration and tension bubble fiercely. It is like watching a pot slowly heat on a stove, the water simmering and rising until the lid threatens to burst off at any moment. Amusingly, despite the political chaos surrounding him, Charles maintains a deep passion for art and culture. He becomes an avid collector, assembling one of the most impressive private art collections of his era. His galleries boast masterpieces by Titian, Rubens, and Van Dyck, a world of beauty and calm that stands in stark contrast to the turmoil that threatens to engulf his kingdom. It almost seems as if the king finds solace in these silent, painted faces, portraits that cannot argue, that cannot betray him, while the real world around him edges closer to rebellion and civil strife. Historians remain divided when it comes to interpreting Charles's reliance on these unpopular fiscal methods. Was his enforcement of such taxation a shrewd necessity born out of financial desperation, or was it an arrogant overreach that severely undermined his legitimacy as monarch? Some scholars argue that he was trapped by the economic realities of ruling without parliamentary subsidies, forced into these measures to sustain the government. Others insist that he gravely miscalculated the tolerance of his subjects and stubbornly ignored the mounting opposition. The debate plays out like a classic struggle between a ruler grasping at power and a kingdom resisting what it sees as tyranny. Religious tensions escalate sharply during this decade as well. The reforms pushed by Archbishop William Laud, aimed at enforcing strict Anglican uniformity across England and Scotland, provoke outrage especially in the Northern Kingdom, where Presbyterianism is deeply rooted in the culture and identity of the people. You can almost see the fiery sermons delivered in packed churches. Hear the rising shouts of angry crowds gathered to protest. Churches transform from mere places of worship into battlegrounds over faith and political autonomy. When Charles attempts to impose a new prayer book on Scotland in 1637, it triggers a fierce backlash, culminating in the Scottish National Covenant of 1638. This was a bold and defiant declaration rejecting the king's interference in religious matters. This moment marks the ignition of the Bishops' Wars, a brutal conflict fought not just over doctrine but over control and survival itself. The Bishops' Wars remind everyone that religious disputes in this era are never just about theological differences. They are intertwined with struggles for political power, identity, and the very future of the kingdom. You might hear the ominous clatter of muskets being loaded, the tense silence in the moments before battle, and the heavy footsteps of troops assembling, as English and Scottish armies prepare to face one another over disputes that began with a prayer book but have spiraled into a full-scale crisis. This war drains the king's treasury and weakens his authority profoundly, shaking the very foundations of his rule. On a lighter and perhaps more curious note, this period also marks the beginning of tea drinking in England, an exotic new habit introduced from Asia through the expanding reach of the East India Company. At first, tea is a rare and costly novelty, enjoyed only by the wealthy elite who sip their delicate infusions with tentative delight. It is a far cry from the widespread national obsession tea would become in later centuries. Picture the early adopters raising their fine porcelain cups, savoring the unfamiliar flavor, completely unaware that this simple beverage would one day become a central thread in British culture, inspiring countless rituals, conversations, and even conflicts long into the future. Scholars continue to debate the true motives behind Charles's push for religious uniformity. Was his commitment to Anglican faith genuine, rooted in deep personal belief? Or was it, instead, a convenient tool wielded to centralize authority and tighten his grip on a fracturing kingdom? This remains a complex question, often pondered over in the quiet of afternoon tea gatherings or, in modern times, perhaps over a stiff whiskey. As the decade draws to a close, the fissures within the kingdom's political and religious fabric widen dangerously. The costly Bishops' Wars forced Charles to finally summon Parliament once more in 1640, ending his lengthy personal rule. However, this short Parliament lasts only a few tumultuous weeks before dissolving amid frustration and deep mistrust. You can almost feel the crackling tension within the grand halls of Westminster, like a family shouting over a dinner table just moments before it shatters entirely. The stage is now set for the long Parliament and the devastating civil war that will follow. Yet, in these uneasy and fragile years, you witness a monarch whose stubborn pride and unyielding faith clash head-on with an awakening nation demanding representation, justice, and voice. It is a tangled and vivid tapestry of extravagant hats, relentless taxation, fiery prayers, and silent portraits, a time when the uneasy calm before the storm is anything but peaceful. As you move into the early 1640s, you find yourself immersed in a period when the simmering tensions that have been building for years finally burst with a force so violent that England is thrown into the chaos of civil war. It feels as if all the hidden grievances, including the frustration over taxation imposed without consent, the harsh religious enforcement, and the king's stubborn personal rule that bypassed parliament, have erupted together into a fierce storm. Muskets roar, swords clash, and political pamphlets flutter through the air like confetti caught in a wild breeze. You can almost hear the harsh clang of armor striking armor and the sharp commands shouted across muddy fields. Where former friends and family members tragically face each other as enemies in battle, one key, well-established fact anchors this turbulent era: the English Civil War officially ignites in 1642. On one side stands King Charles I, backed by his loyal royalists, while on the other side are the parliamentarians, who rally under emerging leaders such as Oliver Cromwell. This conflict goes far beyond a mere struggle for power. It represents a profound clash of visions for England's future. Should the monarch hold absolute authority, ruling without restraint, or should Parliament, and by extension the people it represents, have a meaningful voice in governance? This fundamental question tears the nation apart and fuels nearly a decade of brutal fighting and political upheaval. There is a somewhat curious and even amusing detail in the story. Charles I formally raised his royal standard at Nottingham to declare the start of the war. This standard, a flag symbolizing the king's authority, was hoisted as a bold gesture of defiance. Imagining the scene, you might picture the king waving this flag like an impassioned sports fan brandishing a team's jersey to rally support. It's a dramatic, almost theatrical moment that marks the official plunge into conflict and sets the tone for what follows. Historians continue to debate the deeper causes behind this war. Was it primarily a constitutional crisis centered on governance and authority, or was it more deeply rooted in religious divisions and social unrest? The reality likely lies somewhere in the tangled middle. Personal rivalries between key figures, economic strains, religious discord, and decades of mutual distrust all weave together to form a complex and volatile mix. This ambiguity enriches the story, making it a compelling saga full of conflicting perspectives and no clear-cut villains, almost like a historical soap opera that invites endless interpretation. In the early battles, the strengths and vulnerabilities of each faction come into sharp relief. The Royalists, fiercely loyal to the king, benefit from the support of traditional aristocratic families and possess some well-trained cavalry units skilled in classic warfare. In contrast, the parliamentarians rely heavily on disciplined infantry formations and demonstrate innovative military tactics that begin to redefine how wars are fought. You can almost smell the sharp tang of gunpowder mingling with the earth's dampness, hear the chaotic shouts of officers giving orders over the din, and see the grim resolve etched on the faces of soldiers, many of whom had no real choice but to take up arms in this devastating conflict. Amid the violence and destruction, a fascinating social development takes shape. The war acts as a catalyst for radical new political ideas. Groups such as the Levelers and the Diggers emerge, advocating for revolutionary concepts like democracy and religious freedom. They envision a world beyond the entrenched monarchy and aristocracy, dreaming of a society based on equality and shared rights, ideas that seemed both dangerous and revolutionary to many at the time. You might even picture these early radicals as earnest rebels gathered around campfires, dressed in simple rough-spun clothing, challenging centuries of social hierarchy with fierce determination and hope. The war also profoundly impacts the daily lives of ordinary people. Food shortages become common, alliances shift unpredictably, and the ever-present threat of violence turns survival into a constant struggle. Villages and towns become places of fear and suspicion, where neighbors watch one another warily, and rumors spread like wildfire, sometimes even faster than disease. You might imagine a tired mother clutching her child tightly, anxiously awaiting news of which army will soon march through her home. Uncertain whether they will bring protection or destruction, yet even during such turbulent times, culture continues to thrive in its own way. Cavalier poets like Robert Herrick and John Suckling compose verses that are playful, often bawdy, celebrating themes of love, beauty, and wine with a carefree spirit that contrasts sharply with the grim realities of war. Picture a dimly lit tavern somewhere in the English countryside, filled with the laughter of patrons and the rhythmic cadence of poetry readings, offering a brief and precious escape from the surrounding turmoil. One of the most significant and memorable events of this period is the Battle of Naseby in 1645. Here, Cromwell's new model army delivers a crushing defeat to the king's forces. This battle is widely regarded as the turning point of the war, effectively sealing the fate of Charles I and marking the beginning of the end for royalist hopes. You can almost feel the electric tension in the air before the battle, the scorching summer heat dust swirling across the battlefield, and the echoing cries of victory and despair as the conflict reaches its climax. Historians remain divided on whether Charles could have avoided his ultimate downfall if he had shown greater willingness to negotiate with Parliament or adapted his approach earlier. Was he a martyr who truly believed in the divine right of kings, or was he simply an inflexible man who failed to grasp the changing political landscape? This question haunts the narrative like a persistent shadow, quietly whispering through the annals of history. So, as the 1640s roar onward, you find yourself caught up in a whirlwind of brutal warfare, revolutionary ideas, and shifting power dynamics. The old order begins to crumble, and England faces an uncertain and transformative future filled with both promise and peril. You find yourself drifting deeper into the mid-1640s, a period when England's civil war has evolved into something far more tangled, complex, and chaotic than anyone initially expected or could have foreseen. The battlefield is no longer confined to the muddy fields and rolling countryside. Instead, the struggle spills over into the very heart of the nation, inside the hallowed halls of Parliament, within the sacred walls of churches, and even deep into the minds and hearts of ordinary people. You can almost hear the faint clinking of metaphorical chains as the centuries-old idea of monarchy itself begins to lose its unquestioned status, feeling less like an inherent birthright and more like an outdated, fragile relic clinging to survival. One well-established, grounding fact that keeps you anchored in this swirling storm of history is that after the pivotal Battle of Naseby in 1645, King Charles I is effectively and decisively defeated on the battlefield. His capture shortly afterward marks a monumental and decisive moment in the unfolding story of England. However, rather than stepping back and negotiating a peaceful resolution to the mounting crisis, Charles stubbornly refuses to relinquish his belief in his divine right to rule. He sees himself as the anointed monarch, the sacred king whose authority cannot be questioned or compromised. Watching him cling so fiercely to this belief is a bit like observing someone desperately holding onto a fraying umbrella during a violent hurricane. Utterly convinced that it will somehow keep them dry and safe, despite all evidence to the contrary. You might find it strangely amusing that during his imprisonment, Charles I engaged in secretive correspondence, crafting elaborate political maneuvers and playing a dangerous game of intrigue with his captors. Imagine a king sending coded letters through clandestine channels, weaving plots and trying to turn one faction against another like a character out of a historical spy thriller, but with far more frilly collars, powdered wigs, and less of the sleek, gadget-laden flair of modern espionage. His relentless persistence in clinging to power and royal prerogative ultimately leads to his downfall, a downfall that unfolds in a way both tragic and theatrical, almost as if staged for the ages. Historians remain deeply divided over Charles's stubbornness. Some argue that his refusal to compromise was a principled stand for the divine right of kings, a belief that monarchy must remain absolute and unchallengeable. Others see it as sheer political stubbornness and blindness to the shifting realities of the time, a fatal flaw that doomed not only himself but also plunged the entire country into chaos and civil strife. This enduring debate colors the way we remember Charles centuries later, painting him either as a tragic martyr who died defending tradition or as a deluded autocrat unable to adapt to a changing world. Meanwhile, on the opposing side of this tumultuous conflict, Oliver Cromwell rises from relative obscurity. Beginning as a fervent Puritan and a relatively unknown local figure, he quickly proves himself a skilled and determined military commander, eventually becoming the unquestioned leader of the parliamentarian forces. His new model army is revolutionary in more ways than one. Not only does it bring innovative tactics to the battlefield, but it also introduces new political ideas that shake the foundations of traditional military and social structures. Soldiers in this army are paid regularly, promoted based on merit and skill rather than birth or wealth, and expected to uphold strict discipline and religious observance. Imagine a well-oiled, highly efficient, and godly military machine operating in an era when most armies still resembled unruly bands of mercenaries driven by greed and self-interest. The new model army is also a hotbed of religious radicalism. Soldiers subscribe to a variety of Protestant sects, some of which hold quite extreme and apocalyptic beliefs. Among these are groups like the Fifth Monarchists, who truly believe that they are living in the final days before the prophesied reign of Christ on earth. Picture troops marching off to battle with fiery sermons tucked into their pockets and apocalyptic expectations burning in their eyes. This potent mix of zealotry and strict discipline creates a force unlike any before it, blending religious fervor with military precision in a way that had rarely been seen. Meanwhile, the social upheaval caused by the war ripples through England, shaking the very foundations of its traditional power structures. The conflict disrupts the established order, empowering common people in ways that would have been unimaginable just years before. Local communities begin to experiment with forms of self-governance, and some villages boldly declare a form of independence from the authority of traditional landlords and aristocrats. It is a time of social ferment, a period when centuries-old hierarchies wobble precariously and new possibilities for political and social organization emerge from the chaos. On a lighter note, this period also witnesses the rise of club culture in London, where exclusive social groups gather to exchange witty debate, poetry, and politics, all washed down with copious amounts of ale. This vibrant culture resembles what might be called the original British pub quiz, only without the buzzer or the competitive element. Imagine intellectuals, soldiers, and politicians rubbing elbows in smoky, dimly lit rooms, swapping stories, gossip, and clever bon mots, the air thick with intrigue, tobacco smoke, and the murmur of subversive ideas. Amidst all this turmoil, Parliament faces a monumental dilemma: how to deal with a king who refuses to bend. The idea of putting a monarch on trial is unprecedented, shocking, and almost unimaginable. No European king before had ever been legally judged and condemned by his own people. This extraordinary moment marks the violent collision between centuries of royal tradition and emerging ideas about accountability, justice, and the rule of law. This struggle culminates in the eventual trial and execution of Charles I in 1649, an event so seismic that it sends shockwaves across the entire world. You can almost feel the chilling atmosphere as the crowd gathers outside the execution site, the somber faces etched with grief and resolve, and then hear the echo of the axe falling, an act forever etched into history as one of the most infamous regicides. Historians continue to debate the legitimacy and necessity of Charles's execution. Was it a just act of revolutionary justice that cleared the way for a new political order, or a dangerous precedent that plunged England into deeper chaos and conflict? The echoes of this moment resonate through centuries, shaping the political imagination of generations to come. So, as the mid-1640s unfold before you, you find yourself swept up in a turbulent era defined by radical political experimentation, fervent religious conviction, and dramatic upheaval. This is a time when the old order begins to crumble in earnest, giving way to a new and uncertain future that will forever reshape the British Isles. You now find yourself drifting into the strange and almost surreal aftermath of regicide, a moment in history that marks an extraordinary and unprecedented transformation in England's political landscape. The monarchy, which had been the cornerstone of English identity for centuries, is abruptly abolished, and in its place emerges the English Commonwealth. This new republican government is such a radical departure from tradition that for many contemporaries, it might have seemed as alien and unsettling as the arrival of extraterrestrial beings. You can almost feel the palpable tension filling the air in towns and cities across the country, as ordinary people try to come to terms with this bewildering new reality where there is, quite simply, no king at all to reign over them. Here is a straightforward historical fact: between the years 1649 and 1660, England officially functions as a commonwealth. During this time, political power is concentrated in the hands of Oliver Cromwell, who rises to prominence as the Lord Protector. His rule is a peculiar amalgamation of military dictatorship, rigid Puritan theocracy, and bold political experimentation, resembling a fledgling startup that attempts to reinvent the wheel even as it continues to spin. Cromwell's government enforces a strict code of moral laws, showing marked intolerance especially toward Catholics and members of the Anglican Church. Above all, there is an obsession with order, discipline, and the promotion of a sober, godly society. One of the more striking and almost quirky details of this era is Cromwell's infamous ban on Christmas celebrations. He regarded the holiday as an indulgence in pagan customs and frivolous revelry that distracted the nation from piety and virtue. Imagine an entire country where suddenly your favorite holiday, complete with its feasts, caroling, and decorations, is outlawed. No grand turkey dinners, no singing by candlelight, no festive lights adorning windows and streets. It is almost like living inside a somber, unyielding drama with no cheerful holiday episodes to break the monotony. During those years, people had to conceal their eggnog and mince pies as if they were illegal contraband, a secret pleasure to be enjoyed only in the shadows. Historians continue to debate Cromwell's true legacy. Was he a ruthless tyrant who crushed personal freedoms and imposed an austere regime, or was he a pragmatic and visionary leader striving to hold together a deeply fractured nation during extraordinarily turbulent times? The answer remains elusive and complicated, wrapped in layers of political intrigue and religious fervor. On the international stage, the Commonwealth pursues an unexpectedly assertive foreign policy. Under Cromwell's leadership, the English navy expands significantly, asserting dominance on the seas and aggressively targeting lucrative colonies and trade routes controlled by Catholic Spain and the Dutch Republic. You might picture grim-faced Puritan sailors, armed with a mixture of piety and ambition, boarding enemy ships with strict discipline, preaching stern sermons even as they pursue gold and glory. It is a fascinating and paradoxical blend, a preacher wielding a cutlass in one hand and scripture in the other. Back at home, the Commonwealth government attempts to enforce a vision of moral purity throughout society. Laws are passed to curb drunkenness, swearing, gambling, and other behaviors deemed sinful or disruptive. Even the theater, once a thriving hub of entertainment and culture, faces brutal restrictions. Performances are shut down because they are seen as distractions from religious devotion and societal order. You can almost hear the muffled applause disappearing from London stages and sense the frustration of actors pacing nervously behind closed curtains, dreaming of the day when they might once again bring stories to life before eager audiences. Socially and politically, this era fosters the growth of new ideas about governance and citizens' rights. Radical groups such as the Levelers advocate for expanded suffrage and equality before the law, planting early seeds that will eventually blossom into modern democratic principles. Picture pamphlets circulating in smoky taverns, their pages filled with fierce arguments about who should have the right to vote and why, as the quiet whispers of democracy grow steadily louder amid the silence imposed by Puritan rule. Despite these stirring ideals, the Commonwealth is riven by internal divisions. Religious sects, political factions, and competing visions of the future clash repeatedly, preventing true unity. The army, initially a force that held the country together, becomes a source of tension and conflict. When Cromwell dies in 1658, his absence creates a power vacuum that no one can effectively fill, leaving the fragile experiment vulnerable. The somewhat tragic and somewhat ironic end of this bold political experiment comes swiftly. By 1660, the monarchy is restored with the coronation of Charles II, and England's brief republican interlude quietly recedes into the annals of history. The nation eagerly welcomes back the return of theater, music, and indeed, the joyous celebration of Christmas. It is as if the entire country collectively exhales, shaking off the somber cloak of Puritanism and embracing a renewed spirit of festivity and cultural life. Historians still passionately debate the meaning and significance of the Commonwealth period. Was it a necessary, if imperfect, step on the path to modern democracy, or merely a failed detour in England's political development? Regardless of interpretation, this time remains a critical chapter in which England's national identity and future were fiercely contested and reshaped, like a grand theatrical play filled with shifting scenes and unpredictable actors. As you settle into this part of the story, you can almost sense the heavy tension between competing forces, order and freedom, tradition and innovation, looming in the background like a slow-moving, inevitable storm on the horizon, ready to change everything. Once again, you now gently glide forward into the Restoration era, the vibrant and transformative decade of the 1660s, where England is bathed in the warm, reckless glow of a renewed monarchy. After years of political upheaval and exile, Charles II, affectionately known as the Merry Monarch, triumphantly steps back onto the throne. Imagine the bustling streets of London coming alive once more, filled with an electrifying energy. Theatre marquees blaze with light, drawing eager crowds hungry for entertainment, while taverns and pubs overflow with laughter, music, and the clinking of tankards. This lively atmosphere is a striking and vivid contrast to the strict, somber days of the Commonwealth that have just ended. What unfolds is a cultural renaissance, a lively burst of joy and indulgence, marked by a cheeky wink to the past hardships. Here's a straightforward fact to anchor you: Charles II's reign became famous for its glittering court life and famously loose morals, which earned him the enduring nickname the Merry Monarch. His remarkable skill at diplomacy helped England maintain a fragile political stability during a potentially volatile period. Yet, behind the scenes, his personal life was a whirlwind parade of mistresses, countless illegitimate children, and scandalous gossip that would have fueled tabloid headlines for centuries to come. Picture him as a royal equivalent of a modern-day celebrity influencer. Complete with powdered wigs, silk stockings, and all the extravagant trappings of Restoration fashion, adding a quirky detail to savor, it is said that Charles II had a beloved pet dog known as the Blenheim Spaniel. This fashionable breed would eventually become what we now call the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, a little canine companion padding gracefully through the grand halls of the palace. This small detail offers a charming glimpse of lighter, more personal moments amidst the swirl of political intrigue and court drama. Historians continue to debate whether Charles's relaxed and indulgent style of leadership truly helped heal a nation still fractured by civil war and religious conflict, or whether it merely papered over deeper, unresolved divisions. Was he a pragmatic stabilizer who helped bring peace, or simply a charismatic distraction from England's more serious, underlying problems? The answer might depend entirely on whether you prefer your monarch to have a dazzling sparkle or to possess substantial depth. Amidst the revelry and renewal, a dark shadow falls in the form of the Great Plague of 1665, a terrifying outbreak that ravages London, killing tens of thousands of its residents. The city's usually crowded streets grow eerily empty as people either flee or hide in their homes, hoping desperately to avoid the disease. Yet the plague is ruthless and indiscriminate, picking off victims with chilling efficiency. You can almost hear the haunting toll of church bells ringing out as grim announcements, the muffled cries of those left behind in shuttered houses echoing through the silent city. Not long after the plague, tragedy strikes again in the form of the Great Fire of London in 1666. The blaze sweeps through the city with terrifying speed, engulfing wooden buildings and turning London into a glowing furnace of destruction. Paradoxically, the fire helps bring an end to the plague by destroying the rats and fleas that carried the deadly disease. Picture the city skyline reduced to a swirling cloud of smoke and ash. Then slowly, painstakingly rebuilt with sturdier stone structures and wider, more open streets. This rebirth is like a phoenix rising from the ashes, signaling a new chapter in the city's history. The fire also sparks radical ideas about urban planning, inspiring proposals for straight boulevards, grand squares, and a completely redesigned cityscape. However, practical politics and financial constraints mean much of old London's chaotic medieval street plan survives, leaving the city a blend of the old and new. It's like planning an ambitious home makeover, only to settle for fresh wallpaper and a coat of paint instead. On the religious front, Charles II walks a delicate tightrope, balancing between a policy of relative tolerance and mounting pressure from Parliament to crack down harshly on Catholics and dissenters. Beneath the polished surface of polite society, tensions simmer between Anglicans, Catholics, and various Protestant sects, forming a kind of ongoing tinderbox. This persistent religious conflict is a stark reminder that England's troubles in faith did not simply vanish with the fall of the Commonwealth. During this same period, the Royal Society emerges, England's first formal scientific institution. This new intellectual hub draws together brilliant minds like Robert Hooke and the young Isaac Newton, who begin to unlock the mysteries of nature itself. Imagine candlelit rooms filled with curious scholars conducting experiments and measuring light, gravity, and air. Science steps boldly onto the stage alongside kings, courtiers, and courtesans, reshaping the way people understand their world. You might smile at the Royal Society's motto, Nullius in verba, meaning take nobody's word for it. This phrase encapsulates a growing spirit of skepticism toward traditional authority and superstition, a subtle but powerful current that quietly sets the stage for the Enlightenment, a vast revolution in thought that will soon follow political upheaval. Scholars still argue over how much the cultural bloom of the Restoration era was a genuine renewal of English spirit and identity, versus simply a temporary distraction from deeper political conflicts left unresolved. Was it truly a golden age, or more of a gilded cage? The answer may well be a bit of both, a fascinating mix of dazzling light and underlying shadow. So, as you immerse yourself in this lively, smoky world of 1660s London, you can almost feel the clash of decadence, disaster, and dawning modernity. It is a rich and complex tapestry, pulling you forward, whispering of inevitable change, resilience, and the precarious balance between joy and hardship. Now you move forward into the late 1600s, a turbulent and transformative period when England's political landscape unfolds like a high-stakes game of musical chairs. Power, religion, and wealth are all scrambling fiercely for a seat at the table, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and uncertainty. The glorious revolution of 1688 arrives on this scene, often described as bloodless but by no means dull or uneventful. This remarkable event ushers William of Orange and his wife Mary onto the throne, replacing James II, a Catholic king whose faith and policies stirred widespread suspicion and unrest among many of his subjects. Here's your reliable historical fact: the Glorious Revolution firmly establishes the constitutional monarchy in England. It marks a decisive shift as Parliament asserts greater authority, effectively limiting the king's power through the passage of the Bill of Rights in 1689. This landmark document lays the essential groundwork for modern democracy by declaring that the monarch cannot govern without the explicit consent of Parliament. It's as if the kingdom finally agrees on some fundamental rules designed to keep royal tantrums and absolute rule under control, setting clear boundaries on the power of kings, a quirky detail to enjoy. Despite their shared reign, William and Mary reportedly had an awkward and rather distant start to their marriage. Rather than a romantic honeymoon, they spent much of that early time apart. With William preoccupied by his ongoing military campaigns and political affairs. Imagine a royal couple living together more like polite roommates who rarely exchanged more than necessary words. Not quite the fairy tale one might expect, but somehow perfectly fitting for the political climate of the era. Historians remain divided and passionate in their debates over the true nature of the Glorious Revolution. Was it genuinely a popular uprising, a broad-based movement of the people demanding change? Or was it primarily an elite power grab cleverly disguised as a national salvation story? The truth probably lies somewhere in the tangled middle, much like the intricate and complex branches of a royal family tree, with motives overlapping and alliances shifting. Religious tensions continue to occupy a central and often volatile role in society. Protestants celebrate the overthrow of the Catholic James II as a victory for their faith and security, yet deep fears of religious persecution linger beneath the surface. Laws such as the Test Acts impose strict restrictions on Catholics and other dissenters, barring them from holding public office. This persistent intertwining of religion and politics serves as a constant reminder that these two forces remain inseparable and, at times, explosively contentious. On the intellectual front, the late 17th century stands as a crucible for the burgeoning ideas of the Enlightenment. The philosophies of John Locke, particularly his writings on government, liberty, and the social contract, spread like wildfire through English society and later influenced global political thought. You can almost picture candlelit salons where well-dressed gentlemen and ladies gather to passionately debate freedom, rights, and the proper limits of governmental power. These are the early seeds of democracy, nurtured over good conversation, steaming cups of tea, and the faint aroma of tobacco smoke. In the realm of science, Isaac Newton's monumental work, Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, revolutionizes humanity's understanding of the natural world. It describes the universal laws of gravity and motion with such clarity and precision that it feels as though the universe suddenly has a clear instruction manual. Superstition and myth give way to mathematics and observation. The stars, planets, and even the humble falling apple all obey Newton's elegant rules, grounding human ambition in the predictable laws of nature. Meanwhile, London's coffeehouses flourish as vibrant social hubs, becoming centers for discussion, business dealings, and the rapid exchange of news and gossip. These early cafes function much like the social networks of today, buzzing with energy and ideas. You might chuckle imagining the lively, sometimes heated debates about politics and science over cups of bitter coffee, with conversations occasionally punctuated by surprised reactions to scandalous rumors or sharp-witted jabs. They are proto-Twitters, but with more elaborate hats and powdered wigs. Historians also continue to debate the extent to which this era genuinely advanced liberty and rights for ordinary people. Despite the intellectual breakthroughs and political changes, voting rights remain limited primarily to property-owning men, and women are still largely excluded from formal political power. It serves as a reminder that progress often arrives in uneven, frustrating steps rather than sweeping transformations. So, as you drift through this fascinating time of shifting power, intellectual awakening, and social ferment, you can feel the steady pulse of change beating quietly beneath the surface of formal royal courts and the smoky, crowded cafes alike. As you ease gently into the early 1700s, England finds itself transformed into part of a larger entity known as Great Britain. This change comes about after the momentous Act of Union in 1707, which formally merges the kingdoms of England and Scotland into a single unified kingdom. Picture the political corridors bustling with eager conversations and strategic planning centered around unity and economic expansion. Meanwhile, the kilt-wearing Scots and the tweed-wrapped English attempt to navigate their newfound coexistence, much like reluctant roommates trying to share a space without quite knowing how to get along. This uneasy partnership, full of cultural quirks and deep-rooted histories, is destined to last for centuries. Here's a firm and important historical fact: the Act of Union creates one central parliament seated at Westminster, designed to stabilize what had long been a fractious and often tense relationship between England and Scotland. This political marriage carries with it promises of shared trade opportunities and mutual security. However, it also ignites resistance, particularly among Scots who fear the gradual erosion of their national sovereignty. It's almost like agreeing to share a pizza but secretly longing to keep the extra cheesy slice all to yourself. The tension between cooperation and resentment simmers quietly beneath the surface. A colorful and somewhat amusing tidbit from this period is the infamous gin craze that sweeps through London in the early 18th century. Cheap gin suddenly floods the city, becoming wildly popular among all social classes, from the aristocrat in his grand townhome to the hard-working dockworker on the Thames. Gin shops appear overnight, popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and it's said that London might very well drown in spirits before it runs out of water. This phenomenon serves as a cautionary tale about how what begins as a seemingly good idea, such as distilled alcohol, can spiral rapidly into urban chaos and social disorder. Historians remain divided on the true causes of the gin craze's widespread social havoc. Was it the result of poor legislation and lack of regulation? Or was it a consequence of deep urban poverty driving people to seek escape? Perhaps it was simply human nature reacting to the pressures of life in a rapidly growing, harsh city environment. The answers remain complex and multifaceted, provoking debate to this day. Meanwhile, as you stroll through the bustling streets of London and beyond, you witness the flourishing of the Enlightenment across Europe. Writers and satirists such as Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope wield their pens as powerful tools to criticize society and politics. Their works inject humor, sharp wit, and biting satire into otherwise tense and serious debates. It is as if the pen becomes a weapon more potent and effective than any sword, and the public eagerly embraces a well-crafted roast or clever lampoon. Scientific progress marches forward at a remarkable pace. Figures like Edmund Halley, famed for mapping stars and improving methods of navigation, helped ships sail farther and with greater confidence than ever before. Imagine explorers relying on these groundbreaking advancements to chart unknown waters, pushing the boundaries of the known world. All hinging on the precise edge of a compass needle. This era truly feels like the world is expanding at the fingertips of human knowledge. Politically, the early Hanoverian kings, George I and George II, rule largely from a distance. George I, in particular, famously prefers his native Hanover and speaks English poorly, if at all. This unusual situation leaves real power in the hands of ministers such as Robert Walpole, often recognized as Britain's first Prime Minister. Politics transforms into a game of backroom deals, alliances, and strategic maneuvering, resembling more a boardroom drama than the exercise of royal decree. It's somewhat amusing to imagine a king who spends more time in Germany than in his own kingdom, while Parliament undertakes the heavy lifting of governance back home. It's like hiring a CEO who rarely shows up at the office but still expects a paycheck. Religion maintains its influential role in society but gradually begins to yield ground to a rising secularism in public life. The Church of England remains a dominant institution, yet voices of dissent and religious minorities find increasing room to express themselves. This echoes the slow and uneven progression towards religious tolerance that characterizes the period. Historians continue to debate the extent to which political power truly shifted from monarchs to parliament during this era and what those changes meant for ordinary citizens. Was this a moment of genuine progress for the people, or simply a rearrangement of power among the elite ruling classes, through the haze of smoky gin dens? The labyrinth of parliamentary intrigues, and the lively debates held within bustling coffeehouses, you can feel the vibrant pulse of a kingdom in transition. Sometimes chaotic, sometimes brilliantly inspired, these years mark the emergence of modern Britain as a new and evolving political and cultural entity. You find yourself stepping into the heart of the mid-18th century, a period buzzing with restless energy and transformation as the Industrial Revolution begins to quietly yet irrevocably reshape the very landscape of England. In the distance, smokestacks rise like dark sentinels against the horizon, their chimneys relentlessly spewing thick, sooty clouds that blur the once clear boundary between sky and earth. Factories come alive like mechanical beasts, roaring and churning through the morning fog with unyielding intensity, marking a dramatic shift in how people live and work. Here is the main historical fact you need to grasp: the Industrial Revolution signifies a monumental change. A sweeping movement that carries the economy away from its traditional agrarian roots toward the fast-paced world of industrial manufacturing. Innovations such as James Watt's improved steam engine revolutionize production methods, introducing a powerful new source of energy that eclipses water wheels and human muscle. Suddenly, steam pistons roar into action, driving machines faster and harder than any human labor could ever hope to achieve. This is the critical moment when England begins to turn the wheels of modernity, setting in motion a chain of events that will transform societies forever. A quirky and somewhat surprising detail from this era involves the early factory workers and the strange, often brutal conditions they endured. One notorious example is the clog iron, a rudimentary form of machine guard fashioned from iron bands nailed onto wooden shoes. These clunky, awkward shoes were intended to protect workers' feet from the dangerous machinery, but in many cases, they caused more harm than good, adding to the daily hazards faced by laborers. Imagine the relentless clatter and clang of these heavy footwear echoing down long factory halls, creating a cacophony that serves as a clumsy kind of armor for those grinding through grueling, often exhausting shifts. Historians continue to debate fiercely over whether the Industrial Revolution was an unqualified blessing or a social disaster cloaked in progress. On one hand, it unleashes unprecedented economic growth, technological innovation, and the expansion of industry that propels England to the forefront of global power. On the other hand, it brings with it harsh labor conditions, the exploitation of children in factories, and widespread environmental degradation. Was it genuine progress, or merely a new form of hardship cleverly disguised as advancement? Meanwhile, the cities swell at an astonishing rate as countless people pour in from the countryside in search of work and opportunity. London's population balloons, its narrow cobblestone streets transforming into bustling, congested avenues teeming with horse-drawn carriages, shouting street vendors, and the occasional stray pig darting through the chaos. The sharp, heavy smell of coal smoke mixes with the less pleasant odors of horse manure, creating an overwhelming sensory experience. The city hums with the noise and frenzy of rapid urbanization, a living organism growing faster than anyone could have imagined. In the world of literature, you can almost hear the approaching footsteps of a young Charles Dickens, whose later works will expose the grim realities of urban poverty and social injustice. Though still early in his life, the social tensions and disparities that Dickens famously captures are already simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt into public consciousness. Simultaneously, the British Empire continues its relentless expansion overseas, propelled by industrial strength and naval supremacy. Colonies in distant lands such as India and the Americas become critical sources of raw materials and captive markets for British manufactured goods. Visualize fleets of ships laden with tea, spices, textiles, and other valuable commodities crisscrossing the vast oceans like vital arteries, sustaining the empire's heart and fueling its global dominance. Back at home, social reformers begin to raise their voices with increasing urgency. These advocates call for improved working conditions, educational opportunities for the working masses, and basic human dignity. There is a certain irony here. As machines speed up production and life itself, many people seek to slow down the devastating human cost that this rapid change exacts. Religious revivalism also sweeps the nation during this time. Charismatic leaders such as John Wesley spearhead the Methodist movement, offering hope, spiritual community, and a sense of belonging to those who feel lost or left behind amid the upheaval of industrial transformation. Historians still debate how much the Industrial Revolution truly improved the quality of life for ordinary people in its earliest decades. Was this shift a path toward greater freedom and opportunity, or was it simply a new form of bondage to the relentless demands of industry? The answer remains as complex, layered, and smoky as the very factories that dominate the skyline. As the piercing sound of steam whistles blows through the air and the great wheels of industry continue to turn ceaselessly, you can almost feel the vibrant pulse of a nation stepping into an entirely new age. This new era is full of exhilarating possibilities but also fraught with terrifying uncertainties, signaling the beginning of a future shaped by both progress and profound challenges. You drift now into the latter part of the 18th century, a time when the winds of revolution do not merely rustle papers or stir idle talk, but roar across continents, unsettling monarchs and emboldening commoners alike. These are not gentle breezes of change but fierce gusts that unsettle the very foundations of empires. The spirit of defiance begins to smolder across the Atlantic, as the American colonies grow increasingly restless under British rule. Far from being a distant murmur, this rising discontent soon becomes a thunderous cry for independence, echoing through taverns, town halls, and battlefields alike. A fiery new nation begins to take shape, forged in the crucible of rebellion and idealism. Where revolutionary thinkers dream of liberty and democratic governance, here's your essential historical anchor. In the pivotal year of 1776, the American colonies declare their independence by adopting the Declaration of Independence, severing their legal and political ties to Britain. This document, infused with Enlightenment ideals and bold assertions of human rights, serves as a declaration of war as much as a philosophical manifesto. The event ignites the American Revolutionary War, a grueling conflict that compels Britain to confront the practical and symbolic limits of its global dominance. One can almost imagine King George III pacing in his chamber, the scent of ink still fresh on the parchment before him. As he reads with mounting disbelief that 13 of his colonies have proclaimed themselves free, beyond the reach of his crown, a peculiar yet telling detail emerges from the ranks of the British Army. Many soldiers sent to fight in the colonies were not seasoned professionals, but everyday men drawn from rural towns and bustling cities alike. Often hastily trained and ill-equipped for the unpredictable conditions of North American warfare, they had to quickly adapt to foreign landscapes and unfamiliar customs. Some reportedly learned to cook makeshift meals like cornmeal mush over open fires and navigate dense forests by instinct rather than formation. The image of red-coated troops crouched around smoky campfires, sharing nervous whispers beneath unfamiliar stars, offers a stark contrast to the ceremonial drills and polished boots of parade grounds back in London. Scholars continue to debate the true cost of this colonial loss for Britain. Was it a crippling blow to the empire's prestige and influence, or was it, paradoxically, a necessary shock that spurred introspection and reform? Some argue that the defeat prompted a strategic recalibration, encouraging Britain to invest more thoughtfully in its remaining colonies and military infrastructure. Rather than weakening the empire irreparably, it may have served as a galvanizing force that set the stage for renewed imperial expansion in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Meanwhile, on the domestic front, the political atmosphere within England becomes increasingly charged. The loss of the American colonies feeds into larger conversations about representation, taxation, and the rights of citizens within the British Isles. Reform-minded thinkers begin advocating for changes to the structure of Parliament, hoping to extend political participation beyond the narrow elite. While some aristocrats and royal loyalists push back forcefully, fearing instability and revolution, others cautiously acknowledge that the world is shifting and that governance must evolve to keep pace. Culturally, the late 18th century pulses with creative energy. It is the dawn of the Romantic movement, a literary and artistic rebellion against the constraints of rationalism and industrial rigidity. Figures like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge step into the spotlight, crafting poems that exalt nature, emotional depth, and the individual's inner life. These works provide a lyrical counterpoint to the cold gears and smoke-choked cities that define the industrial age. In this era, a walk through the Lake District is not merely a stroll, but a spiritual journey, a quiet protest against the mechanization of the soul. Scientific curiosity also flourishes. Joseph Priestley, among other pioneering thinkers, makes groundbreaking discoveries, such as the identification of oxygen. His experiments, conducted in modest laboratories filled with bubbling glassware and flickering candlelight, mark an early milestone in the journey toward modern chemistry. One can envision him meticulously observing chemical reactions, driven by the belief that understanding nature is a path to human improvement. Religious dissent intensifies during this period as well. Groups outside the established Church of England seek spiritual autonomy and community. Methodism, led by figures such as John Wesley, grows rapidly, appealing to working-class citizens who feel alienated by the formality and hierarchy of the Anglican Church. The landscape of English spirituality becomes more varied and layered, reflecting broader shifts in society's values and voices. There is a quiet humor, too, in the way high society reacts to these changes. You might smile at the thought of powdered wigs and corseted aristocrats wrinkling their noses at the idea of poetry about waterfalls and rustic shepherds. What place? They might wonder, does a daffodil have in a world of titles, estates, and courtly dances? Even so, historians still question how deeply these cultural and intellectual movements penetrated the lives of ordinary people. Was Romanticism a true expression of the common soul, or was it an elegant pastime reserved for salons and study halls? Did the growing interest in nature and emotion reflect a societal longing, or did it remain confined to the literate elite? Through all this, England stands at a moment of profound transformation. The empire may have suffered a wound in the Americas, but its heart continues to beat with determination. New ideas swirl in the air, borne on the winds of change. Political institutions are questioned, artistic norms are upended, and scientific frontiers are pushed. It is a time of reckoning, a crossroad of uncertainty and promise. The path ahead is unclear, but the resolve to forge onward is unmistakable. As you settle into the dawn of the 19th century, England hums with the accelerating rhythm of the Industrial Revolution, now no longer a mere spark but a roaring engine that powers the transformation of society. The clatter of looms, the hiss of steam, and the grind of machinery form a constant background chorus, while across the English Channel, the spectre of Napoleon looms large. The Napoleonic Wars cast a long and ominous shadow over the continent, intertwining with England's own domestic changes like vines around a growing tree. Picture rows of grimy factories lining the city outskirts, chimney stacks belching dark plumes into the sky, even as young men in red coats marched to the docks and board ships bound for distant battlefields. The very ground beneath English society seems to shift, as if the tectonic plates of history are realigning beneath people's feet. Here is your concrete historical anchor. Between the years 1803 and 1815, Britain becomes embroiled in a relentless and costly struggle against the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. These conflicts, known collectively as the Napoleonic Wars, reshape not only the military and political fabric of Europe but also affect every corner of British life. At sea, the Royal Navy asserts near-total dominance, securing crucial trade routes, enforcing naval blockades, and asserting imperial strength. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 becomes a defining moment of national pride. As Admiral Horatio Nelson leads the British fleet to a decisive victory, though at the cost of his own life. Imagine the tension in London drawing rooms and newsrooms alike, where rumors swirl and handwritten dispatches bring news of glory or grief, feeding both patriotic fervor and quiet dread. A quirky and often retold detail of this era lies in the unraveling of Napoleon's grandest campaign, the ill-fated invasion of Russia. Despite his military genius, Napoleon's forces fall victim not only to resistance but to nature itself. A brutally early winter in 1812 crushes his army, freezing supplies, morale, and flesh alike. One might find it oddly poetic that in a century dominated by man's inventions and aspirations, it is the ancient force of weather that decides the fate of empires. As if the snows themselves had chosen sides, history turns on a frigid axis. Historians continue to debate the broader implications of the Napoleonic Wars on British society. Some argue that the prolonged conflict stirred a newfound sense of national identity and unity, galvanizing industrial production and innovation. Others contend it was an exhausting drain on resources and lives, delaying necessary reforms and entrenching inequalities. Was this war a painful but necessary forging of modern Britain, or an imperial misadventure prolonged by pride and fear? Back on the home front, the machinery of industry grinds onward. The mechanization of textile mills and coal mines surges ahead, driving economic growth but at immense human cost. Cities expand rapidly, often without planning or sanitation, as thousands of rural families relocate in search of factory work. Working conditions are brutal. Children as young as 5 are pressed into labor, working from dawn to dusk under the harsh glare of overseers. Imagine small, soot-streaked faces peering from behind spinning wheels, the deafening whir of machinery drowning out all else. The whistle of the factory not only marks time, but also serves as a warning, a shrill reminder of lives bound to the rhythms of production. In the midst of such hardship, the Regency era blooms with cultural distinction. Despite the surrounding turbulence, salons, assemblies, and soirees become fashionable among the elite. Literature flourishes. Jane Austen, with her sharp wit and unflinching eye, captures the intricacies of social class, gender, and economic pressure with stories that remain iconic centuries later. Her characters attend balls, navigate propriety, and search for suitable marriages, but beneath the elegance lies a clear-eyed critique of the social order. Religious movements also experience renewal. The evangelical revival encourages personal morality and champions causes like poverty relief and education. Among its most influential figures is William Wilberforce, who leads a determined campaign against the transatlantic slave trade. His efforts culminate in a landmark victory: the British Parliament abolishes the slave trade in 1807. It is a momentous occasion, celebrated by reformers and clergy alike. Yet historians question how deep the commitment to equality truly ran. Was this change born from genuine moral awakening, or shaped by shifting economic interests and the desire to polish Britain's global reputation? Meanwhile, scientific curiosity surges forward. In modest laboratories and smoky workshops, inventors and thinkers push the boundaries of the known world. Michael Faraday, an unassuming bookbinder's apprentice turned scientist, begins groundbreaking work with electricity and magnetism. His discoveries, still in their infancy, hint at a dazzling future of electrified cities and instantaneous communication. Yet for now, the flickering glow of oil lamps and candlelight still guides people through the dark. Through it all, the noise of factories, the thunder of cannon, and the quiet ticking of laboratory clocks echo a nation caught between conflict and progress. England, at this juncture, stands poised between tradition and transformation, balancing war, industrial might, moral awakening, and the dream of a more equitable society. The path ahead is uncertain, but the momentum is undeniable. You drift gradually into the heart of the 19th century, entering a world where Victorian England's sprawling cities throb with a paradoxical vitality. The streets teem with energy and contradiction. Life is accelerating on many fronts, propelled by the power of steam engines, the buzz of telegraph wires, and a national ambition that drives the relentless expansion of empire. Everywhere you turn, progress and disparity walk hand in hand. London's infamous fog hangs thick in the air, not just a meteorological phenomenon but a symbol of the age's blend of mystery and grime. It snakes through the narrow alleys of working-class neighborhoods and curls around the grandeur of boulevards lined with imposing stone buildings. Every breath carries the scent of coal, industry, and change. The central historical moment of this period is Queen Victoria's accession to the throne in 1837. Her reign, which stretches for over 60 years, comes to define not just a country but an entire era. Under her rule, Britain emerges as a dominant industrial and colonial power, projecting influence across continents. Victorian values, architecture, fashion, and technology all bear the unmistakable imprint of this long reign. Picture yourself walking down a gas-lit street in Victorian London, where the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages mingles with the sharp clatter of factory machines. Shop windows glow behind lace curtains. Men tip their top hats. Women in tight corsets and sweeping skirts move through a world held in tension between strict decorum and deep social undercurrents. A curious and slightly macabre detail of this era lies in its elaborate mourning customs. The Victorians developed a near-theatrical obsession with death and bereavement. Mourning attire followed strict rules, often requiring mourners to wear somber black for extended periods. Locks of a deceased loved one's hair were fashioned into jewelry, kept in lockets worn close to the heart. Some families commissioned mourning dolls, uncanny figures crafted to resemble lost children, often displayed in drawing rooms or cradled in silence. These tokens of sorrow transformed private grief into public ritual, creating an atmosphere where loss itself became part of daily decor. You might imagine a heavy curtained parlor, hushed and shadowed, with glass-eyed dolls staring solemnly from velvet chairs. Historians continue to debate the true nature of Victorian morality. Was the era genuinely marked by stern repression and rigid codes of conduct, or was it a cleverly maintained facade covering a much more complex and often contradictory society? Behind the stiff collars and tightly drawn curtains, the public face of virtue often clashed with the private pursuit of pleasure, ambition, and subversion. Some argue that Victorian prudishness was merely the surface of a deeper, more nuanced social dance between appearance and reality. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution surges ahead with unstoppable momentum, transforming England into what many proudly call the workshop of the world. Railways spread across the countryside like veins of steel, shrinking distances, connecting once isolated towns, and fueling commerce and communication at an unprecedented scale. Factories hum with activity, producing everything from textiles to locomotives, from fine porcelain to machinery destined for foreign shores. The Great Exhibition of 1851, hosted inside the glittering Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, showcases Britain's industrial and artistic achievements to the world. Inside that vast hall of glass and iron, visitors marvel at innovations that promise to shape the future. Yet, beneath this facade of triumph, shadows deepen. The rapid growth of cities leads to the proliferation of slums, where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease fester. Cholera outbreaks claim thousands of lives. The contrast between rich and poor becomes painfully stark. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick begin to push for better public health policies, emphasizing the importance of clean water, sewage systems, and housing reform. You might shudder at the thought of the damp, windowless tenements that housed entire families in a single room, their lives a world away from the refined drawing rooms of the elite. Scientific thought takes a dramatic leap forward. In 1859, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, introducing the theory of evolution by natural selection. His work sends shockwaves through both scientific and religious communities, igniting fierce debates in churches, salons, and universities. Imagine the dinner table conversations as people struggle with the implications of humanity's place in nature. To some, Darwin's ideas are liberating and exhilarating. To others, they are heretical, deeply unsettling to long-held beliefs about divine creation. The British Empire continues to expand with formidable ambition. The British Raj is firmly established in India, while colonial enterprises stretch further across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The empire brings immense wealth and exotic goods to the British Isles. But it also raises difficult ethical questions that linger even today. Imperial ventures come at a human cost, and debates surrounding exploitation, cultural erasure, and national identity simmer beneath the surface of patriotic pride. Culturally, this is an age of literary giants. Names like Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte appear on the spines of well-worn novels, their Gothic tales full of passion, isolation, and psychological complexity. These stories, often set against bleak moors and windswept estates, reflect the darker undercurrents of Victorian society. Their heroines challenge traditional roles, seeking autonomy and voice in a world that often silences them. The legacy of Victorian England remains a subject of intense historical scrutiny. Some view it as a golden age of progress, innovation, and global influence. Others see it as an era built on inequality, hypocrisy, and exploitation. The truth, as always, lies in the interplay between these extremes, layered like the heavy fabrics and tightly laced corsets that define the fashion of the time. As you wander through these fog-draped streets, past factories pounding with industry and drawing rooms glowing with gaslight, you witness a world at its zenith. Brilliant yet conflicted, assertive yet introspective, Victorian England stands as a crucible of modernity, its legacy etched into the world that follows. You arrive now at the dawn of the 20th century, a world standing at a precarious crossroads, where long-standing traditions begin to tremble beneath the weight of new technologies, powerful social awakenings, and the ominous stirrings of global conflict. The atmosphere in London is one of layered contrasts. Horse-drawn carriages still clatter along cobbled streets, while the rumble of early automobiles and the faint hum of electric trams hint at the momentum of modernity. Gas lamps flicker beside newly strung wires, and chimney stacks rise beside telephone poles, signaling a city in the grip of transformation. The solid historical anchor here is the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. Her passing closes the book on a monumental era and ushers in the Edwardian age, named for her successor, Edward VII. This new chapter is defined by a shimmering surface of luxury and ease, especially for the aristocracy and upper middle class, yet beneath that polished exterior lies a simmering unrest. The working class grows increasingly vocal, and the suffragette movement begins to swell with bold defiance. You might picture spirited women marching shoulder to shoulder down wide avenues, wearing purple, white, and green sashes, hoisting banners that demand votes for women, their voices cutting through the din of the city. echoing with a fierce clarity never heard before. A particularly unusual and striking detail from this time involves the hunger strikes used by imprisoned suffragettes. These acts of protest were not just symbolic, they were visceral demonstrations of willpower that forced the government into uncomfortable visibility. Authorities responded with the brutal act of force-feeding, a practice that left emotional and physical scars. Imagine the unsettling image of a woman restrained in a prison cell, a feeding tube forced into place, as she fought silently for the simple right to be counted. Historians continue to discuss whether the Edwardian era was a graceful twilight of Victorian grandeur or the early tremors of revolutionary change. Was this a time of gentle fading, or did it plant the seeds for the upheavals to come? The truth, as ever, lies somewhere in between. At the same time, technology is rewriting the rhythms of everyday life. The telephone, once a novelty, is becoming an essential tool of business and connection. The flickering wonder of early cinema draws crowds into darkened halls, where silent films unravel stories in jerky black and white motion. Over in America, the Wright brothers take to the air in 1903, and the world watches in amazement as heavier-than-air flight moves from fantasy to reality. In drawing rooms and cafes, people marvel at the headlines, imagining a future not just grounded in machines, but soaring above them. Politically, the tensions building across Europe form a taut and dangerous web. A complex system of alliances, intensifying nationalism, and expanding militaries turns the continent into a pressure cooker. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in 1914, the spark falls onto bone-dry tinder, and the world is plunged into war. Britain, bound by alliances and imperial duty, enters the fray, and with it, the entire empire is drawn into a four-year catastrophe unlike anything before. The social consequences of the First World War ripple through every class and corner of society. Millions of men are sent to the trenches, enduring mud, gas, and shellfire. Back home, women step into roles previously closed to them, working in factories, running businesses, and managing the machinery of everyday life. These shifts in gender dynamics are not easily reversed. The war's brutality leaves a profound mark on public consciousness, unraveling old ideas of heroism and duty. The old certainties shatter, and in their place comes a quieter, more skeptical view of power and tradition. Culturally, the years following the war see the rise of modernism, a movement born from the chaos of conflict and the fragmentation of meaning. Artists and writers abandon the formal structures of the past, experimenting with form, voice, and vision to reflect a world permanently changed. Jazz music begins to pulse through cities, flappers challenge gender norms, and a restless spirit takes hold. The meticulous order of Edwardian society gives way to something looser. Faster, and far less predictable, scholars still argue whether the First World War was the force that accelerated change or simply revealed fractures already forming. Was it a necessary rupture or an unimaginable tragedy that deepened old wounds? As the century shifts forward, England and its empire stand at a complicated threshold. Technological marvels continue to astonish, while long-standing hierarchies falter under pressure. The empire itself grows increasingly difficult to justify, burdened by its own contradictions. You close your eyes in this moment, feeling the heartbeat of a world caught between memory and momentum, its future not yet written. Wind down, now, as your thoughts begin to slow and the story retreats into the soft hush of memory. Picture the flicker of a single candle, its flame steady and warm in the surrounding stillness. The centuries have rolled past like slow-moving clouds, and the dust of history settles gently, leaving behind only whispers, footsteps echoing across wet cobblestones, of letters unfolding in distant lands, of secrets murmured in forgotten libraries where time itself seems to hold its breath. The great and tangled tapestry of England's past stretches across your imagination, embroidered with queens crowned and kings fallen, with inventors and poets, with factory smoke and harvest fields. Its threads shimmer with triumph and sorrow, with grandeur and strife, with moments of dazzling clarity and others cloaked in shadow. Always, it remains textured and complex, shaped by those who walked its roads and dreamed in its silence. Feel the stillness now, the quiet comfort of the present, where no battles rage and no bells toll. The soft sounds of countryside and city life merge into a kind of lullaby, as if the world itself is exhaling after the long wait of centuries. The past, having shared its stories with you, now folds itself away like a well-worn map, tucked into the corners of your mind, waiting for another night of discovery. Breathe in slowly, and let the hum of history fade like a faraway song. Let your thoughts drift through empty streets and ancient corridors, where each shadow holds a forgotten tale, and each silence a sliver of wonder. Sleep comes gently, carrying with it the echoes of all you've seen, and all you've yet to imagine. Rest now, knowing the stories are safe with you, and tomorrow will come in its own time. Good night.